Today's reading comes from Hebrews chapter 7, verses 1 through 10, and we're going to skip to 20 through 28. As always, it's going to be up on the projection. Please feel free to read along with me. Here we go. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham as he was returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom all Abraham apportioned a tenth part of all the spoils, was first of all, by the translation of his name, King of Righteousness, and then also King of Salem, which is King of Peace. Without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, he remains a priest perpetually. Now, observe how great this man was, to whom Abraham, the patriarch, gave a tenth of the choicest spoils. And those indeed of the sons of Levi who received the priest's office have commandments in the law to collect a tenth from the people, that is, from their brethren, although these are descended from Abraham. But the one whose genealogy is not traced from them collected a tenth from Abraham, and was blessed the one who had the promises. But without any dispute, the lesser is blessed by the greater. In this case, mortal men receive tithes, but in that case, one receives them, of whom it is witnessed that he lives on. And so, to speak, through Abraham, even Levi, who received tithes, paid tithes, for he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. And inasmuch as it was not without an oath, for they indeed became priests without an oath, but he with an oath through the one who said to him, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever." So much the more also Jesus has become the guarantee of our greater covenant. The former priest, on the one hand, exists in greater numbers because they were prevented by death from continuing. But Jesus, on the other hand, because he continues forever, holds his priesthood permanently. Therefore, he is able also to save forever those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercessions for them. For it was fitting for us to have such a high priest, holy, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens, who does not need daily, like those high priests, to offer up sacrifices, first for his own sins and then for the sins of the people, because this he did once for all when he offered up himself. For the law appoints men as high priests who are weak, but the word of the oath, which came from the law, appoints a son, made perfect forever. This is the word of the Lord.
You may be seated. Thank you, Chris. If you know my personal history, you would know that I've spent time living in different parts of the world at an age when I can remember it. I've spent time living in Korea, Virginia, Vancouver, and Houston. And of all those places, although I've lived in a bunch of different places, it is my firm belief that the best of all the places that I've lived in is, without a shadow of a doubt, Houston, Texas. And therefore, Houston is my home, and Houston is where I belong. Now, I'm sure some of you might think I'm crazy, and others of you would love nothing better than to prove me wrong. But whether you agree with me or not, one thing is certain: you will not convince me otherwise, right? And the reason why is because if you were to dare try, you better bring your A game, because let me tell you, convincing other people that Houston is better than the rest is something that I'm quite experienced in, and therefore also really good at. In fact, for a little while, amongst my colleagues and peers, pastors across the nation, I was kind of known as the guy who would always try to convince other people that Houston was better, and therefore try to convince them that they should move here to our great city. As I said, I rep Houston hard. And if you think it's not the case, yesterday did not make it any better, because if you didn't know, last night the Cougs made it to the national championship. Go Cougs. Not that I went to U of H, but again, I rep our city hard. And so Monday night, even though I have to get up 4 o'clock in the morning, I will most likely be up watching the national championship game, hoping that the Cougars beat the Florida Gators. Now, for those of you who didn't immediately think of a city or cities even that you feel are better than Houston and the reasons why, you might be wondering, what is it about this city that Pastor Pete loves so much, right? Why? Why Houston of all the places? And maybe also you're thinking, then how would he convince other people that Houston is indeed better? Because I don't see it. Maybe you're thinking that. And if you're wondering this, the answer to me is actually pretty simple. I simply just go about one by one, as if in a checklist, listing all the ways that, in my opinion, I believe Houston is better than whatever city I'm comparing it to. For instance, I'll note that the cost of living here is so much cheaper. Your money goes further than other places. And then I'll follow that up by saying, although the cost of living is cheaper, we're still a major city. We give you all the things that major cities will offer you, right? Sports teams, events, concerts, and all that culture and stuff. And then, of course, I'll talk about my favorite thing about our city, which is, of course, if you don't know, Houston is one of the best food cities in all of America, period. With one major exception, of course, which to some of you might be important, Korean food, because Korean food here is abjectly terrible. But for me, that's never been a problem. Why? Because I grew up eating my grandmother's homemade Korean food, and in my opinion, the best Korean food is found here at our church when it's made by our grandmother. So again, no problem for me. Houston is where I belong. I, indeed, am a Houstonian. And then with all that said, I'll finish. And this is kind of where the argument kind of takes a little bit of a side turn. Sometimes it works. Actually, most of the time it doesn't. I'll finish with the reason why Houston, to me, is better than the rest. And that's because Houston is home. It's where my family is. Yes, my personal family, my wife, my kids. But of course, my mother-in-law and also my parents. But also, and I mention this every single time, you. This is where home is. Y'all are home for me. Houston is home. As they say, home is where the heart is. And this, indeed, there's no place like home. Now, I tell you all of this because the book of Hebrews has essentially been doing the same thing, whether you recognize it or not. It's been an ongoing list of all the ways that to the author, Jesus is better than the rest, with a few warnings thrown in if you've been here. It's been an ongoing plea from the author to the audience to understand why Jesus is far superior than anything else, and why, therefore, they should, one, not turn back to Judaism. If you remember, if you've been here, that's been one of their problems. But more secondly, to draw deeper and deeper into Jesus. And that's what he's been doing this entire book, and what he's going to do continually throughout. And for review, the argument has essentially gone like this. Ooh, I went off my slides. Ooh, what happened? The argument's gone basically like this. Pretty simple, right? He begins by basically saying, Jesus is the ultimate treasure, the final word. Followed by how Jesus is better than superior than the angels, followed by how Jesus is better than even Moses. And then most recently, he's been talking about how Jesus is the best or the perfect high priest, better than everyone, including this mysterious Melchizedek. And by the way, this better theme is going to be the theme throughout the rest of this book. As we journey to the end of the book through Lent, through Palm Sunday, Resurrection Sunday, and so on and so forth, this better theme is indeed the thing. It's why our title today suggests Jesus is better forever. So as we then jump into the text, which I admit is actually quite long. It's really nerdy, by the way. It's kind of like a PhD paper almost, like he goes about it and kind of roundabout. The whole idea of this for us is simple. While the author is trying to prove to his audience that Jesus is better, therefore they should not turn from him, but towards him, for us, the question today is simply this. Is Jesus better? Period. Is he better than anything and anyone else? And how do we know for sure that Jesus is better? Because if you don't have reasons for Jesus being better, then you're never going to be able to convince yourself, nor anyone else for that matter, that indeed he is better. And the reason why this is important is because for me, simply, how we think, how we talk, what we do, and therefore what we choose will always and forever be ultimately a decision of better. You will choose every single time that which you think is better in whatever category. So for us in life, is Jesus better, actually? Is his way better, or is someone else's way? Fill in the blank of whoever. Is it that better? Is Jesus better, or is fill in the blank better? And to be sure, let me tell you, in life, whatever is better will always win. That's why I told you, I live in Houston, because Houston is better. It's the best. So for you, for all of us, Is Jesus indeed better? Is his way better? Will you choose his better way always and forever? That's the question that we want to ask and therefore answer, and hopefully convince that indeed it is. Because when that is true, Jesus will indeed be your Lord and Savior always and forever. Let's jump in, shall we? Now, how we're going to kind of make this argument or break it all down is like this. And again, it's a bit nerdy, but this is what the author does. First, we're going to prove that Melchizedek is better than Abraham. Then we're going to hopefully try to prove that Melchizedek is like Jesus, but not quite, but kind of. And then third, Jesus is still yet better, though he's like Melchizedek. And then fourth, Jesus is better forever. Now, before we begin, again, let me just say this to you. I'm going to work you through the author's argument. It is quite nerdy, like I said. It's what Pastor Chris is going to get into in his PhD studies. It's very academic like that. Kind of walk through it with me. You may not be all that interested in some of this argument, but indeed at the end, the question is going to remain, is Jesus better? Okay, so don't get lost in the weeds, but let's go through that first. First, Melchizedek is greater and better than Abraham. Now, the whole argument of the author can be summarized like this. The overall goal for the author is to prove that Jesus is better than the old Jewish faith. And he's been doing it. I told you the argument structure before. And where he's come to in the line of reasoning, where the argument is basically, he has to prove that Jesus is better than all the high priests of the old Jewish religion. And the reason why that's important is because the high priest played this very, very important role in the faith of the Jewish people, right? Basically, their job was to mediate, right? To kind of mitigate the people's sin and help them to deal with their sin before a holy God. And so what the author is basically saying is this: hey, do you know Jesus is so much better than all the high priests, so much better than you'd ever know. And the way he's going to go about doing it is first by talking about Melchizedek being better than Abraham and so on and so forth. And because he's really nerdy, this is how he goes about it. He goes back to Genesis 14, where Melchizedek appears for the only time in the entire Hebrew Scriptures as a person in history, and then he talks about that being Abraham and onwards. Here's what he says. If you remember from Genesis 14, it's actually at the very beginning of the story of Israel. And in Genesis 13, what happens is Abraham and his nephew Lot, they separate, right? And they have to go different ways. Why? Because the land is not big enough or great enough for all their people and their livestock and so on and so forth. So they separate, right? Lot chooses his way, and then Abraham and so on goes, so they go. But after they separate, what happens is that Lot gets caught up in this war between warring enemy kings. And then because he gets caught up in the war, he then gets taken captive, right? And he gets taken away. So Abraham hears about his nephew, about all this, and then he decides, hey, I'm going to go rescue Lot. So what he does is he takes soldiers. And even though he's thoroughly outnumbered, he goes into battle, slays one set of the kings, wins the war, and then rescues Lot and all of his people. Now, from a social perspective in those days, and at any point, at this moment, Abraham is literally on top of the world. He is a valiant warrior, a war hero, a defeater of kings and kingdoms, and the rescuer of captives. In some ways, things could not have gotten any better for Abraham. But interestingly, right at this point, at the tip of when he should have been untoppable, therefore, this mysterious king priest named Melchizedek shows up and essentially steals the show. Here's what it says in Genesis 14. Then after the return of the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings which were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. And then another king, Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of the God Most High. He blessed Abraham and said, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. He gave him a tenth of all." Now we might not seem or take much away from this at first, but the author of Hebrews wants us to understand two really, really important things that happen that definitively, without a shadow of a doubt, make Melchizedek better than Abraham. And that's one, Abraham gives Melchizedek a tenth of the spoils, and then two, Melchizedek blesses Abraham. Here's how this works. Verse 4. He says, "Now observe how great this man was, to whom Abraham the patriarch gave a tenth of the choicest spoils." In those days, giving a tenth of the choicest spoils, the first tenth of anything, is always what the lesser party gave to the greater party. Whether it's a gift of thanksgiving, a recognition of honor, show of respect, whatever it might be. And of course, if you know, the people of Israel, we always give a tenth of our first offering to God. But what makes this kind of exchange particularly special is that if you read in Genesis, there is zero mention or zero definitive reason why Abraham should have given Melchizedek anything. There's no reason. And the only reason that you're supposed to then take away from the text is basically Abraham gave Melchizedek the spoils because it was clearly apparent to Abraham and everybody else that Melchizedek was so great he deserved it. Melchizedek's greatness was so apparent and overwhelming that Abraham, though he had no real reason to do so, no duty, no responsibility or anything, simply does. Why? Because sometimes when someone or something is so great, you just have a natural proclivity, right? The thing to recognize and appreciate it. So Abraham's like, dude, you are amazing. Let me just give you my war spoils, even though you had nothing to do with the war. Then in verse 7, the author then points out, but without any dispute, the lesser is blessed by the greater. Again, making this point very clear. If you're Korean, you're familiar with this tradition during New Year's called sebe, right? Looks like this. And this tradition is pretty simple. It's where the lesser or the younger, right, honors and bows to the older, saying, right, blessings be to you this New Year's, and then in return you get money. I mean blessings, right, which of course many of the blessings is money. But this is kind of the exchange that happens. The lesser bows to the older, the greater, and then the greater bestows New Year's blessing, wisdom, good health, whatever it is, onto the lesser. So the idea basically is the greater ones always bless the lesser ones. And so what the author is saying is in this situation, that proves without a shadow of a doubt that Melchizedek is better than Abraham. He's definitively the greater of the two. Now here's why this is important. Again, nerdy stuff. Melchizedek being greater than Abraham proves without a shadow of a doubt factually that Melchizedek is better than all the Levitical priests. And that's the point he's trying to make. Why? Because simply all the priests of Israel, including the high priest, were of the line of Levi. And Levi is a descendant of Abraham, a son of Abraham. And fathers are always greater than sons in those days and even nowadays many times. And so although it be plainly obvious to them, he wants to make sure that there's zero confusion. And so he said, and so to speak, through Abraham, even Levi, who received tithes, paid them, for he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. What he's saying is simple. The reason why you have to know that Melchizedek is better than Abraham, and that makes Melchizedek better than the high priest, is because all the priests are sons of Abraham. And when these two people met, Melchizedek and Abraham in history, as nerdy as it might sound, it's true. The sons of Abraham, the line of Levi, the priests, they were still not yet even born. So of course, Melchizedek is greater than Abraham. I know, really nerdy way of getting at things, but that's how he does it. So first thing he does is check Melchizedek greater than the high priest. Important. Second, then, Melchizedek is similar to Jesus, but kind of. The next line in the author's reasoning is to then show how great this Melchizedek is, especially as a forerunner, a preview, a foreshadowing of the greatest high priest, Jesus himself. He begins with then how Melchizedek uniquely resembles Jesus, or the technical term is how Melchizedek is a typological figure of Jesus. Here's how he does it. First, we're told that Melchizedek is both king and priest, like Jesus was. Verse 1. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham as he was returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. In those ancient days, the idea of a priest king was a common thing outside of Israel, but within Israel, it was never a thing. There's kind of one instance where one king tried to be like the priest, didn't go well for him, and priests and kings were always kept separate in Israel. And the reason why is because kings represented God to the people, right, by bringing the law, and priests represented the people to God by offering sacrifice for them. So they had to be kept separate because their roles are very important that way. But we're told that Melchizedek, and of course Jesus, this is not the case. Why? Because they're both king and priest. So there's one commonality there. And the second commonality, we're told, is that Melchizedek's name means righteousness, and because he's the king of Salem, which in Hebrew means peace. Verse 2, from whom Abraham apportioned a tenth part of all the spoils, first of all by the translation of his name, king of righteousness, and also the king of Salem, which is peace. If you know anything about Jesus, the Bible makes clear that righteousness and peace are two of his defining characteristics. In the prophet Isaiah, right, 9:6-7, for a child will be born to us, son will be given to us. The government will rest on his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. There will be no end to the increase of his government or of peace on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and uphold it with justice and righteousness from then and forevermore. Righteousness and peace. To add to it, Psalm 85, we're told that our God, in Yahweh, righteousness and peace essentially kiss each other. God isn't who God is if righteousness and peace don't come together. And what we're being told is when righteousness and peace come together, it's as they say, chef's kiss. That's when it's made all good. So they have that in common. Then there's more. Verse 3. without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor the end of life, but made like the Son of God, he remains a priest perpetually. Now, this verse has been confused a little bit in history, but what they're basically saying is this. Some people think that Melchizedek, by this means, like somehow he's like eternal, just like Jesus, God, like God-like, he can't, there's no beginning, end, he's not born, whatever. That's not what this means. What this means is basically, because Melchizedek doesn't have any mention of a genealogy, no mention of what line he's from, his ancestors, none of that, what it's basically saying is that he was an appointed king and priest. And this is really critical, right? Because every king and priest of Israel all were because of what? Their genealogy, their line. All the priests had to be in the line of Levi or Aaron, period. Most kings were so. Why? Because of their bloodline. But Melchizedek, he appears and disappears in history. There's no mention of where he came from, who his father is, or where his genealogy is, none of that stuff. And basically what it's meant to say, the absence of the information suggests that God has appointed him to be king and priest. He doesn't need the genealogy. He doesn't need these things. He is in this way, therefore, a priest perpetually because God appointed him to be so. And the only other person in the history of the world that can claim this is also Jesus himself. Well, that's why it says in verse 14, for it is evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, a tribe with reference to which Moses spoke nothing concerning priests, aka Jesus, because he's in the line of Judah, should not have been priest. And the only reason why he's priest is because God appointed him such. And again, sounds nerdy, but this point can't be understated. Here's why it matters. Throughout the history of Israel, all priests were determined by their family line, priest after priest. They were indeed from the line of Levi. So whenever one priest died, then the next one in line would take over and become priest and so on and so forth. Now, this sounds normal to us, and it is, but what it means is this, that in the line of then all the priests, what you're going to get every once in a while, or maybe often, is a bad priest. Why? Because the priests aren't priests because of their qualifications. They're priests because of their bloodline. Does that make sense? They're not priests because they have all the qualities and characters of. They're just priests because they were born into it. But Melchizedek and Jesus, because they're priests that had nothing to do with their bloodline, but only on divine appointment, aka God chose them, what it means is that they're fundamentally different than all the priests, aka God is vouching for their character. You can trust them. They're good priests, unlike the ones you might get. So all of that is then this author's way of saying, see, Jesus is also better than the Levitical priest. Why? Because he's like Melchizedek, but he, as you'll say, is even still then better. I know, nerdy stuff. Bear with me. Now that the author has kind of convincingly shown his readers, at least, why Jesus is the best, perfect high priest, the author is going to get to the part of the argument that I've been eager to get to, that I think he's been eager to get to, and this is where things all kind of come together and make sense and get awesome. Everything so far has been, as I've said, kind of tedious, cumbersome, and if that's the way you feel and you kind of haven't been paying attention, don't worry. You're not the only one. Hebrew's been often known as one of the harder books to understand in the New Testament, and this is kind of a reason why. But the point you got to take so far is the author's trying to prove to those people that Jesus is better than any of the other options as high priest. And for us, as I said, we need to start to understand why Jesus is better than all the other options of people, things that say that indeed they are better than Jesus. I'm thankful for the author of Hebrews because he's not doing the, hey, just believe it because I told you so kind of argument, but let me prove it to you kind of argument. But now, here's the part that I think you should really pay attention to if you haven't been so far because it's been difficult. Verse 11. Now, if perfection was through the Levitical priesthood, for on the basis of it the people received the law, what further need was there for another priest to arise according to the order of Melchizedek and not be designated according to the order of Aaron? The author is saying the main reason the old Levitical priesthood had to be replaced is because it wasn't good enough. It was insufficient, not good enough to bring the people to perfection, as you'll see. Now this word, you may remember from last week, chapter 6, means maturity, completion, perfection. It's the Greek word telos, if you remember. But here in verse 11 and verse 19, this is a specific form of the word that means something like this: to put someone in the position in which they can come or stand before God. It's to grant access to God and allow someone to stand. This is why in verse 19, the author says, for the law made nothing perfect, and on the other hand, there's a bringing of a better hope through which we draw near to God. The author is saying what the law could never do, and therefore the Levitical priest could also not do, was to grant you and I or anybody access to God. so that we can draw near to him. Why? Because the whole system was in many ways designated or designed to limit our access or even keep us a certain distance away from God. If you remember from last week or even the previous few weeks, you learned that a primary function of the priest was to help atone, right? Receive forgiveness for their sins from God. And while this was done daily and even weekly, right, in the temple, the high priest every year, once a year, would go through all these different rituals to clean and cleansify and purify himself, right? And then get ready to enter the Holy of Holies, which is separated quite literally, physically, by a veil so that only he could enter. So that in there, then the high priest could first offer up sins for himself. And then once having done that, if that went well, then offer the sins for everyone else so that everyone else could ceremonially, once a year, have their sins cleansed and purified and then do it over and over and over. And what the author is saying is this. While there are very many good reasons why this was done all throughout the history of Israel, and while you may think that there may not be other options because this is the only thing that existed, do you realize that because of Jesus, because of what he did on the cross and through the resurrection, everything has changed, and more deeply, not only has everything has changed, you finally now get to have the thing that you wanted and needed. You just didn't know you needed it and wanted it in the first place, and that's access to God. F.F. Bruce says this: the whole apparatus of worship associated with sacrifice, ritual, and priesthood was calculated rather to keep men at a distance from God than to bring them near. And this is not meant to sound negative or bad, because it may at first, but it isn't. The idea in the Old Testament is this: there's a holy God and there are sinful people. If sinful people and a holy God meet, do you know what happens? They die. Because our sinfulness is so bad compared to his holiness and righteousness that we would just go poof almost in a smoke, right? And then we would just die. And so what they did was they created a system that literally would keep the people at enough of a distance so that they wouldn't suffer this fate. So the whole thing was designed so that we could have a forgiveness of sin without dying. And if you think this is crazy, remember the story with Moses? Moses goes to God, hey, God, I want to see your face. And God's like, hey, you can't. Why? Because you would die. So here's my plan. Go to this crevice of a rock. I'm going to cover you with my hands, pass you, and you're going to see the backside, just enough of the backside. Because if you see anything more, again, you'll die because you're sinful and I'm holy. And then Moses' face shown. That's kind of the idea. A certain distance was needed so that we wouldn't die because our sin is so great and his holiness is so great. And so while this isn't necessarily bad or negative, what the author is saying, because of what Jesus has done, do you not realize that things are now different and more? Things can be better. But why are you settling for things that aren't as good? Because things are better. Verse 19, for the law made nothing perfect. On the other hand, there's a bringing of a better hope through which we draw near to God. He's saying now you don't have to do all that stuff. Because of what Jesus has done, we have a better hope. We can draw near to God. We don't need the old ways. We have a new way, a new, better hope. In verse 22, a better covenant, which we'll talk about next week. The old has gone and the new has come, the author says. Jesus is so special because he's in the priest in the order of Melchizedek, and he is someone unlike anyone else we've seen. He's done something that you and I didn't know we needed, but indeed we do. We want access to God. We want to get closer to him. We want to have, indeed, a fellowship and a communion and a relationship with him. That's what Jesus has done. Then the final point. How? Well, here's how. Because Jesus is better forever. If you read from the beginning to the end of the chapter, you're going to realize that the author mentions this idea of forever, perpetual, permanent 8 times, and then 2 instances that kind of make it like 10, although not directly. The main and most definitive point of the author that differentiates the priest in the line of Melchizedek, in this case Jesus, from the Levitical priests, without question, is simply this. All Levitical priests die, but Jesus lives forever. And for us, the point is this. Every other ideology, thinking, way, whoever that person is, they all die. But Jesus is the only one that lives forever. Now, one note of clarification about Melchizedek. Again, when the author says that he does not have beginning nor end, and he's like the Son of God, it does not mean that he literally didn't die or doesn't have a beginning, wasn't born. That doesn't mean that. The idea the author is pointing to again is that because there's no mention of those things, the idea is his priesthood is meant to last forever. That God's appointment of him is indeed meant to be perpetual. That he is different, just like Jesus is very different. But here's the difference between Melchizedek and Jesus. And again, we'll get to the me here. Melchizedek is who he is special because there's kind of this mystery, as in there's this absence of information. We don't know anything about him. He just appears and then disappears, and we're like, okay. But Jesus is different. Why? Because we know so much about him. And although he's mysterious because he's God and yet human, we know so much that helps us to know him in a way that we can't know Melchizedek. And the thing that we know about him that's most important is he is forever. And that's key. Look at all the different ways that the author mentions this, right? Verse 17, you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. This is what's declared about Jesus in Psalm 110. Verse 21, Yahweh has sworn himself that he will not change his mind. You are a priest forever. Verse 23, 24, the former priests on the one hand existed in great numbers because they were prevented by death from continuing. But Jesus on the other hand, because he continues forever, holds his priesthood permanently. Therefore, he is also able to save us forever, those who draw near to God through him, since he always forever lives and makes intercession forever for us or them. And then verse 28 finally, for the law appoints men as high priests who are weak, but the word of oath, which came after the law, appoints a son made perfect forever. The point the author is making is quite clear now. He's saying if you thought the Levitical priests are great, and that's why you're going back to them and turning away from Jesus, and if you're saying maybe the reason why they're great is because there's so many of them and there's only one of Jesus, that's a flawed argument. Why? Because the only reason why there's so many of those priests is because they all have to die. Once they die, you got to replace them. That's why there's so many of them. The only reason why there's only one of Jesus is because he never dies. That's the idea. He continues forever. Why? Because he has the power of an indestructible life, it says in verse 16. He's saying Jesus, because he lives forever, because his life is indestructible, he can therefore save forever and give you access to God forever, those who are saved forever. The reason why Jesus is better, bar none, is because he is our priest forever, doing things that other priests can do. Why? Because they all die, but he does not. And because he does not, we get access to God also forever, because we also live forever. And the point is, who else is better than him if he's the only one that can do this and claim this? And again, for us, think of all the things you subscribe to. Think of all the ways that you believe and all the things that you believe and the ways that you do the things that you do. Who is the beginning and the end of those things? But no matter who or what is the beginning and end, it all has an end. And the only one that doesn't is Jesus, period. And if that weren't enough, then the author finishes like this. Because not only is Jesus forever, what makes Jesus forever even greater are these two things. Things that we can never forget and therefore hopefully will make you believe and know and therefore understand Jesus is indeed better and we should follow him forever. And the two things are this. Jesus, no one could be like him. And secondly, no one would dare try to be like him. First, no one could be like him. Verse 26, for it was fitting for us to have such a high priest, holy, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners and exalted above the heavens, who does not need daily, like those high priests, to offer up sacrifices, first for his own sin and then for the sins of the people, because this he did once for all when he offered up himself. The author's saying what we have in Jesus is someone that will never ever be. Why? Because Jesus is perfect, sinless, faultless, undefiled, and holy. He's saying, as amazing as any of the high priests were, and we're not taking that away from them, as respected and revered as they might have been, the one thing that they will never and they can never be is what Jesus always is, perfect and holy. The one defining characteristic that we truly need in a high priest, someone who's going to navigate our sin, mitigate it, and help indeed dissipate it, is that person needs to be perfect. And that's something that no high priest can ever be, no matter how hard they try. This is why he's saying the high priest, they have to go in and make a sacrifice for their own sin, because they have sin too. There's one thing that is always going to connect us with those high priests, their sin, our sin, but Jesus, no sin. And so because he doesn't have to offer up sacrifice for his own sin, he can then offer himself up as the sacrifice for our sin. And it's the only thing that's going to erase it forever and ever. Every single time the high priest went into the Holy of Holies, people were actually kind of on edge because they didn't know if it was going to work. Because if he messed up in the rituals, and you can go look up the rituals, they're crazy. You got to spend days alone, and you got to wash a certain amount of times, eat, whatever, all this stuff. But Jesus, he offers himself. Why? Because he's the perfect and true holy lamb, and only he can do that. That's why the author says it's fitting for us to have such a high priest, because we have to realize only he can do this for us. None of the other things that we believe in life are going to be able to do this, that which Jesus can do for us, that the author is saying. Do you realize, he's saying, church, then and now, later and forever, there will never be anyone like Jesus, period. There's only one of him. And we need him more than you'll ever dare know. Why? Because he says, for the law appoints men as high priests who are weak. But God appoints a son made perfect forever. And then this is the second thing, because this is the thing that makes Jesus far and away better and forever. Period. The thing that's absolutely mind-boggling about what Jesus has done, even beyond the fact that he would sacrifice his life for sinful people like us, is it, in doing so, what it accomplishes. And what it accomplishes is it makes us, you and I, sons, daughters, and fellow heirs. Now think about it. Who in their right mind, if they are the heir to the throne, gives up that position for people who don't deserve it? No one. And then if you add on the fact that to do so, they have to die not for their sins, not for things that they've done, but things that someone else did, it just doesn't happen, period. I didn't say this at 9. I think I have time to say this now. Have you seen the movie Mufasa? I know. Lion King? I know. It's all over the place. If you haven't seen it, I'm going to spoil it for you. I apologize. The whole idea is how the Mufasa character came to be. Do you know the story? Have you seen it? Go watch it. It's on Disney+. It tells of his old story. Mufasa's a stray who gets lost by a flood. Then he gets picked up by this pride. And then he becomes the brother of the heir to the throne. And then they're supposed to go, and then another rival pride comes in, and they're basically killing everybody, so then they run away. Mufasa and his brother Taka. And the whole idea is he's supposed to be king. But it's clear that Mufasa is the better, supposed to be king. And then in the long run, you know what happens? The people elect Mufasa, the animals elect Mufasa to be king. And then Taka gets pissed, because not only did Mufasa get the kingship, he also gets the girl. It's always about a girl. And then he becomes the evil brother, Scar, in the long run. The idea is, you don't give that up, ever. And if you're the son of the Most High God, appointed to be priest, you don't actually take that appointment. Why? Because it means he knows he's going to have to sacrifice himself for us so that we can be heirs to the throne. And that's why when he goes on the cross, the veil is torn, we're given access. But we're not given just regular access. We're given access as sons and daughters of the King. Do you know what that means? It means we get to be the thing that we've always wanted. All of us wants to have direct access to the only God and King who can live forever, who is perfect, holy, never makes mistakes, loves perfectly, and all those things. We want access to him because that's what we all desire in life, to belong to a people, to belong to a God, to belong to someone that makes us exactly who we're supposed to be. And Jesus, the perfect high priest, sacrificed himself so that we can indeed do so. And what the author is saying, why are you spending your time, wasting your time, praying, thinking, living by anything else other than this God, the only God who can indeed give himself up so that you and I can be sons, something that you and I would never sniff and ever have a dream of being? It doesn't make sense, he's saying, because Jesus is better forever. Let me finish with a story that Pastor R. Kent Hughes tells. that makes this point really clear. Apparently there was a pastor way back when by the name of Donald Gray Barnhouse. He studied in France, and he pastored this little church in the French Alps called the Evangelical Reformed Church. Now, once a week, Pastor Barnhouse would go to a neighboring town to take a class. And then on the way there, apparently there was, from that town, a local priest, a Catholic priest, that would then make his way over to Pastor Barnhouse's town to do the same thing, take a class, and they would always cross paths with each other. And over time, this happened literally every single week, and so they got to know each other, and then they got to be friends, and they started talking, and then every single time they would pass, they would have like 10-minute conversations or so. And then one day, apparently, the priest goes to Pastor Barnhouse and goes, "Hey, friend, why is it that you evangelicals, Protestants, don't ever pray to the priests?" And then Pastor Barnhouse was like, "Why should we?" So then the priest, as every priest and pastor would do, gave this illustration to prove his point. He says, say you needed to have an interview with the president of France. Well, one way you do so, because you can't just ask the president for an interview. That doesn't happen. You don't have access to that. The way you can do so is you either go to the Ministry of Agriculture, or the Department of the Interior, or whatever, some department, and then you try to get access to one of the president's cabinet members. And you got to do that up the chains of command and all that kind of stuff. But if you succeeded and you actually got to the cabinet member, then perhaps the cabinet member, if he or she shows favor upon you, will then give you access to the president. So that's why you pray to priests, because the priest is the cabinet member in this example. And the only way you're going to get to the president, God in this case, is to get through the cabinet members. How else are you going to do it, he says. So after this, he apparently thought he killed it, nailed the example, nothing to say here. And then Pastor Barnhouse retorted or responded like this. Now, at that point in history, apparently, the president was Raymond Poincaré. And he lived in the LEC, which is the White House of France, apparently, at those times. And he said, "But friend, suppose that I were the son of President Poincaré. I live in LEC with my father, because he's the president, I'm his son. And after breakfast one day, I get up and I kiss him goodbye as he's going to his office for work. Then say afterwards, I then go down to the Ministry of Agriculture and ask the fourth secretary and the second assistant if it's possible for me to see the Minister of Agriculture. And the fourth secretary of the second assistant asked me, why do you need to see the Minister of Agriculture? And he goes, because I'm hoping to get an interview with my papa and I need to get through him to get there. Makes no sense. It's stupid, actually. It's absurd that a son would have to go through all those chains just to get to his father. Then Pastor Barnhouse finished like this. He goes, but friend, don't you know that you, because of Christ, are a child of God and therefore an heir and joint heir with Christ, and you don't need to do all that because you can go straight to the Father, now and forever. Who else gives you that kind of access, he says? No one. He gives you all the yearnings of your heart forevermore. And the fact that he would die for our sins to make them no more forever so that we could be that, that's why Jesus is better forever. Don't you see? Church, through this Lenten season, and for the rest of your life, in fact, everything in this life is going to say I or he or she or this or that is better than Jesus. And the author's trying to prove in the nerdiest way possible, but I think he makes the point clear, there is no one better than Jesus. There's no one that's going to do for you what Jesus has done. There's no one, therefore, doing what he does is going to accomplish for you all that Jesus has done. In the rest of this Lenten season, next week, Palm Sunday, Good Friday, and Resurrection Sunday, our hope through the book of Hebrews is to prove to you that without a shadow of a doubt, no matter who or what you put him up against, Jesus is better forever. And though it may sound degrading, we would be foolish to choose anything else. Will you trust that indeed he's better forever? But more so, will you see, understand? So church, during this time, the rest of this Lenten season, got a couple weeks left, will you fix your gaze upon him? Look at the beauty of his face. See the scars. Be washed by the blood. And know by the Holy Spirit that there is none indeed better. Not now, not before, not later, not forever. Always, only Jesus, better forever. forever. And may you be blessed in the knowing, and therefore follow him, and in doing so live life the way you were meant to from the very beginning until the end, aka no end of time, all eternity, to the glory of his name. Jesus, better forever, and you, lucky bums, sons, daughters, and heirs of the King, now and forever. Take some time to reflect and give him the glory and receive the blessing being a child and heir of the King, and then we'll sing together.